Hello, my name is Paul Michaud, and I'm the CEO of Proceve. Today we're going to talk about dependency management. Dependency management is critical to any successful project. Without it, it's literally impossible to effectively estimate project timelines or manage change. So, in order to tackle this, we've built fairly robust handling into Proceve software to manage dependencies, even in the most complex projects. So, what's a dependency? Well, essentially, a dependency is a specific type of traceability relationship between artifacts that dictates the order in which they must be completed. These are often reflected in what we consider to be a timeline view or a Gantt view back, decades ago, and essentially, they show those relationships that you can't do A until you've finished B or whatever. So let's look at some examples of dependencies. If I want to ride a bike, I can't actually do that until I first get a bike. If I want to build a house, first I have to design the house. Let's say I want to finish a web page. Well, first off, I probably have to write the content for the web page. Now, you notice here that the content for the web page arrow is pointing to the end. So the content only has to be done before the web page is finished. I can actually start the web page before I've written all the content. I can design the graphics, right? And I can do them in parallel with working on the page. So the arrow is pointing to the end here. But all of this has to be done in a certain way. I probably, in a lot of cases, can't design the graphics until I've come up with the content. Now, in practice, that's not necessarily true, right? But typically, we might have an idea of we're going to write about this and we're going to build a graphic to then correspond to what we wrote about. But the reality is we can go the other way around, or we can even do them in parallel. But these are just some simple examples of dependencies. And they come up all the time in everyday work or everyday life, and they definitely come up all the time and are critical in a project management context. So typically there are 4 types of dependencies. And for each of these, we're going to look at these and we're going to look at what is the type that they're usually referred to, what's a short form way of representing them, what is the pattern that they represent, and then a short description of it. So the most common is what we call finish to start. So I can't start B until I finish A. Okay? So this is what's called finish to start, as I said, and the code that we use for that is FS, finish to start. There's also what's called finish to finish, which we showed in the previous examples where I could finish the website at the same time as I finish the content. So finish to finish uses the short code FF, and it basically means you can't finish B until A is also finished. We also have start to start. Short code for this is SS, and it basically says I can't start B until I also start A. And then finally we have start to finish, right? Short code for that is SF, and it basically says you can't finish task B until you at least start task A. Okay? And some of these come up more frequently than others. As I said, pretty typical is finish to start or finish to finish is more common in my experience with the kinds of projects that I've typically dealt with than the start to start or start to finish. So the other thing to keep in mind is often we think about the dependencies in the context of a task, and strictly speaking, that's true. But we can also think of them as a relationship between any project artifact. For example, if I've got a task A, which is to implement a requirement B, I can't do task A to implement requirement B until I've actually written requirement B. So in theory, I can indicate this as task A is dependent on requirement B in a finish to start perspective. Now, if I wanted to be really pedantic, which I never see anybody do, I could say, well, technically there's a task that is to write requirement B, and therefore I'm dependent on the task to write requirement B, not the actual requirement. And while that's strictly true, in practice, I never see anybody do that. So we allow for you to actually have these dependencies across any artifact in the system, whether it's a diagram, a document, a requirement, a task, a test, an issue, it doesn't matter. Another example is if I've got that requirement, I can't write the test case to test the requirement until the requirement is actually written, for example. So this is a case of a test artifact being dependent on a requirement artifact. In addition, if I want to execute that test, I can't execute the test until I've written the test and the task that implements the requirement is actually done. So in this case, my execute test, task depends both on the test artifact and on another task artifact. And by inference, it actually depends all the way back to my item to do requirement B. So why does this matter? If I was to then go into the system, let's say I'm working on requirement B and I've already planned, a timeline and resources assigned to do task A, but for some reason requirement B doesn't get finished on time and I have to move it. Well, by knowing that all of these other items depend on requirement B, our system will actually reschedule and move everything based on the fact that requirement B got delayed. And that's really important when you're trying to determine when am I going to be done, what resources do I need when. And if you can't track all of this, then your estimates and your timelines are invariably going to be hugely off. So it's really, really critical.